A key open problem in cognitive science is that human beings are able to have vast ideas in here and now minds that are highly localized. Our concepts themselves stretch across vast ranges of time, space, causation, and agency. Think of some examples from law. Contracts and wills stretch indefinitely over time, space, agency, causation, actions. Statutes apply indefinitely over these great ranges. Testimony from witnesses about the past stretches over memories and inference, and judges and juries have to make decisions about the reliability and accuracy of these vast concepts. Legislative oversight assesses situations and decides on policy in law. Now, an example of a vast thought in law is the sine qua non test, the but-for test. That is, if you want to know whether or not a certain person can be held culpable for a certain harm, well, you take the action that you think might have led to that harm, and you imagine that the action did not happen. Run the simulation mentally in imagination across all those causal links, all that time, space, and alternative agents, and see whether or not the harm still obtains. And if it does not, then the action cannot be the cause of the harm, and the agent can't be held culpable. This means not only that you have to take a four-dimensional time, space, causation, and agency concept stretched across vast ranges and imagine it as corresponding to something that was actual. You also have to make another four-dimensional vast network that corresponds to a path that was counterfactual. And then you have to compare them and compress the counterfactual relationship into a property in the current actual reality, namely culpability, blame, error. This is such a complicated event that many philosophers of law have raised doubts about it. Hart and Honoré, for example, in their famous 1985 work, reject this test. Now the hitch is that these vast concepts are being produced with machinery that is entirely localized. All one has in order to think these vast thoughts is present biological machinery. It is true that we, of course, manufacture and respond to material artifacts and situations to help us, to prompt us to think of these vast thoughts, but our reacting to and interpreting of those artifacts and conditions are still a matter of here and now biology. This is very old news. Sherrington in 1906 pointed out that the brain is an enchanted loom with millions of flashing shuttles weaving a dissolving pattern. The emphasis is on dissolving. It's always meaningful, but it's never biting. You have temporary activation in a local biological system, and this is what is producing these vast thoughts. This very old news produces very old problems. It's well known in psychology that our memory is not like a video camera recording device. We are in many cases very bad witnesses, although we are quite certain of our memories. Our ability to recall even recent events may be quite poor at times. We attend very selectively. Our perceptions change depending on our intentions. We manufacture consistency in the world by making great compressions, e.g. color constancy, and we reconstruct memory on the basis of the here and now to a great extent. How can here and now minds achieve such vast ideas? Well, I want to point out that this question is orthogonal to the question of internal versus extended cognition. All human beings, all cognitively modern human beings for the last 50 or 60 or 70,000 years seem to have been set up fundamentally for extended cognition. We use our bodies to help us think. We, of course, use the environment we're in to help us think. We use the night sky to help us compute. We use other people to help us think. Those other people, those sundials, certainly the night sky, are not contained within our neurobiology or our skin. We are set up for extended cognition, but this extended cognition is all being run by here and now machinery. Let us take an example of how one of these great networks of time, space, causation, and agency, far too large to be held in working memory, quite uncongenial to the human mind, can be transformed into something at human scale that is tractable for human thought, that is tractable for our here and now biological thinking machinery. That example is the cyclic day, analyzed in a book that Gilles Fauconnier and I published in 2002. One's experience of days is that there is a day, and then another day, and more time, and another day, and another day, and another day, and then a day, and a day, and then another day, and another day, and it just goes on. No day repeats. If a given day started to repeat, we would think that we had gone insane. Even in the movie Groundhog Day, when the same day supposedly repeats, there are many different events in each successive day. But we can compress all of those days by blending them into a single day. What do I mean? There is a standard generic integration template very widely used across human cognition for this purpose. It's not the only one, but it's quite a common one, in which many different ideas, many different concepts in a network of thought have analogies running across them, and of course also disanalogies. We compress the analogies to a single entity, maybe to a single group, something that we can hold on to mentally. And we compress all the disanalogies to change for that single identity in the blend. And this is what we're doing with the cyclic day. All the days are compressed in the blend to a single day. Now there's just the day. And all the disanalogies are compressed to change for that day. In this case, the day repeats. The day starts again. Now notice this is not just an abstraction. In your abstraction of a day, the day does not repeat. Nothing comes around again. We can refer directly to this blend. We are not deluded. And what we say about the blend can be unpacked by our audience to apply to the vast and difficult network. So for instance, if I say dawn is coming around again, you're not confused. You know that I'm talking about a compressed blend, something congenial to human scale, the single cyclic day. I can say now it's time for my morning coffee. If you think of the great network of all those individual days, that's indefinite series of days, that sequence that goes on and on, it's impossible to hold in working memory. Where is my morning coffee in this network? It's not there. But in the blend, there is a particular spot, not exactly defined, but a range, in which my morning coffee has a position. I don't always have to have my morning coffee in order for my morning coffee to have its place in the cyclic day. I can say this part closes at dusk. Notice no one says dusk. You mean today or dusk yesterday? No, we know what this means. It closes at a certain spot in the cyclic day. We all know the concept of the cyclic day. One that might be less well known is the concept of a decedent. A decedent is an example of a quasi-agent, the creation of an individual intentional agent in the compressed blend that doesn't actually correspond to someone with the identical status in the network that we are compressing, the network that stretches over time, space, causation, and agency. There are many such quasi-agents in human cognition, and the pattern for creating them is highly robust. In law, there might be various documents, such as wills, that need to be treated, and the existence of these documents in the here and now may be connected to agents that are no longer here. So, for example, when a will is being executed or adjudicated, we need a way to create a congenial agency that lies behind what we take to be the intentions expressed in the will. And this agent has a name. It's a decedent. As Charles Fillmore has analyzed, we canonically refer to the decedent using the present tense or the present perfect, indicating the here and now consequentiality of the intentionality in the network that we're trying to consider. We say if the decedent has no surviving spouse, not if the decedent had no surviving spouse. If the decedent has living parents, siblings, nieces, or nephews, the decedent leaves his house, or the decedent has left his house. Notice that decedent has a very precise status in this blend. It doesn't refer simply to someone in the past who died. If we are asked, are both your parents living? I can't answer, no, they're both decedents, unless, of course, they have died sufficiently recently that various legal documents are currently being adjudicated, documents that they had an intentional relationship to. In law, it is very common to see compression over time, space, causation, and agency to create a localized and unified intentionality in the blend. We speak of legislative intent or judicial opinion. We talk about the Johnson administration. It's an incredible compression. We talk about the market as if there is such a thing, and can attribute intentionality to it as an agent. So if the Dow Jones Industrial Average is in the high 12,000s, we can say that the market tried for 13,000. This is an attested quote. When the market closed slightly below 13,000 before a 3-day weekend, a journalist wrote, "Because of President's Day, the market has 3 days to eye 13,000. Law has often shown itself to be quite ingenious at constructing compact blends for anchoring these expansive legal concepts. In the United States, for example, we have the concept of a legal person, which includes churches, charities, corporations, and so on. This blend is highly congenial to the human mind, portable and unpackable. We know what a person is. We can unpack this concept to access, manipulate, and consider vast ranges of information over time, space, causation, and agency. We're not deluded. We know that the entity in the blend that we're considering to be a legal person does not receive full projection from our concept of a person. Projection is always selective and is compressed with a lot of other information. There can be discussions about what counts as a legal person, and the selective projection can be debated. So, for example, in 1886, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Southern Pacific was, of course, a legal person and had standing as a person under the Constitution. Recently, in Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that free speech did apply to certain corporations and legal persons, and so they had the right, the privilege, to contribute resources to campaigns for elections. More recently still, AT&T, a corporation, argued to the Supreme Court of the United States that they were entitled to the personal exemption described in the Freedom of Information Act, since, after all, AT&T is a legal person. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously against AT&T, and Chief Justice Roberts wrote in the opinion, "We hope AT&T does not take it personally." Examples are easy to proliferate. For the last several years, and perhaps for years to come, Europe and much of the rest of the world's financial systems and people have been roiled by considerations of what will happen to the euro currency, what will happen to the eurozone. The time scheme here stretches over decades. The geographical region is at least all of Europe. The number of agents and institutions and actions involved is unthinkably large. The causal links are very, very many. And yet, it's very easy for us to talk about the eurozone, or depression in the eurozone, or the future of the euro. In the blend, we have, in a nutshell, compressed concepts that are congenial to the human mind and that we can carry with us. The compressed blend gives us mentally a platform where we can stand, something congenial, something stable. A platform where we can stand and reach up to access, manipulate, rearrange parts of a network that's much too large to be held in working memory, a network that is not congenial to the human mind, a network that we otherwise would not be able to manipulate. Now roll back 70-odd years. How do you convince someone in the American Midwest to limit his or her gasoline consumption in order to help the war effort? Just imagine the distance of causal connections between pumping gas in a Midwestern state and activities in Central Europe involving warring armies. The time, the space, the causation, and the agency is much too big to be held by itself in mind. But it's possible to make a nutshell blend that gives us a way to think about the network, gives us something congenial and portable to carry with us, to expand, to contemplate this vast network. And the blend is two people. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Of course, the blend indicates that the driver is not delusional, that we are not delusional. We do not actually think that Hitler is in the car with the driver in this hypothetical situation. And there are many techniques in communication for indicating how entities in the blend relate to entities in the network. In this case, you see that Hitler is sketched. There are other kinds of representations, shadows, reflections in mirrors, ghosts, indicating frequently that there is an entity that is extremely important in the blend, but is not actually materially where that entity is situated in the blend. Hitler is very important for the network and is conceptually important for this blend, but is not actually to be interpreted as resident in the car. Now roll your here and now mind 20 generations forward. Notice how natural that sounds. It's common for us to think that the mind can actually inhabit separate times simultaneously. Memory seems to bring the past to us, but of course, memory does not open a window on the past. Memory does not give us movement to a previous time. We're not really Doctor Who in a TARDIS able to roll through time. Memory is here and now. Any memory that we have is the use of here and now biological systems to construct something that we take as referring to temporal, spatial, causal, intentional activity in a much bigger network. But roll your mind forward 20 generations, which means, of course, use your here and now mind to begin to put together a vast conceptual network. And think of the future of the climate on Earth. This is what Al Gore asks you to do in his movie, An Inconvenient Truth. In order to get you to be able to handle that kind of network, he needs to make a compression that is congenial to the human mind. He makes a spatial compression by compressing all of the Earth to one pale blue dot. On the screen, the Earth is a pale blue dot, a tiny point on a huge cosmological background. It's difficult even to pick it out when he points at it. And Gore says, everything that has ever happened in all of human history has happened on that dot. All the triumphs and tragedies, all the wars and all the famines, all the major advances, that is what is at stake, our ability to live on planet Earth, to have a future as a civilization, end quote. Now, of course, this conception of seeing the Earth from 4 billion miles away is already a blend. It's not something we can do. We do know, at human scale, that if we back away from something, then the object subtends an ever smaller span of our visual field. And we can imagine doing that for 4 billion miles. Now, we don't really know from our personal experience what vision would be like over a span of 4 billion miles. There are many human systems that don't seem to work quite the way one would expect at enormous ranges of time and space, but it's easy to put together a blend in which you imagine moving away from an object 4 billion miles and seeing what it looks like. And in fact, this picture of the pale blue dot is a photograph made from 4 billion miles away. Very easy for us to make that compressed blend, but it has consequences. Now the Earth becomes something that's actually contained in our visual field. And in our environment of evolutionary adaptation, the things that were in our visual field are the things that are most likely to be able to influence us, and that we are most likely to be able to influence. The Earth is now contained in this compression, entirely in our own visual field. Similarly, he makes a very aggressive compression over time and agency. He says, future generations may well have occasion to ask themselves, what were our parents thinking? Why didn't they wake up when they had the chance? We have to hear that question from them now. In the network we need to contemplate, those generations live very long after we have all died. They probably don't speak English. In fact, most of them are not speaking at all. They're just thinking or writing. Maybe they're having conversations with each other in languages that we don't know, languages that don't even exist yet. And yet, all of that is compressed into present agency, children who are actually speaking to you in your own language. Now, notice this works even if you don't have children, personally. In the blend, you do have children. They're right in front of you, and they are scolding you, criticizing you for abdicating your parental responsibility. This is an extraordinary compression of time, space, causation, and agency. And it has a particular benefit that's worth emphasizing. The human affective emotional systems are set to deal with things that are at human scale. But clearly, these vast networks of time, space, causation, and agency are not at human scale. An affective system is a very useful cognitive system. How can we recruit it to think about things that lie far beyond the scale of what they were built to be deployed to think about? Well, if you make a compressed blend that is at human scale, that is in registration with what our affective systems can contemplate, what our affective systems can respond to, then you can recruit the entire affective system of the mind in order to help you manage, grasp, manipulate, process elements that run across the vast network. Here are other examples analyzed in Fauconnier and Turner, 2002, The Way We Think. When Hicham El-Garouche set the world record in the mile, the New York Times wanted to indicate the magnitude of the accomplishment, and to do so, it created a graphic in which little figures are placed on a mile track. These figures are Hicham El-Garouche and 5 of the very fastest milers over previous decades. Each of these milers had set the world record. They are placed on the graphic track where they would have been had they been running against Hicham El-Garouche at an average pace calculated from the amount of time it took them to run the mile on the occasion in which they set the record. This compresses across 40, 45 different years. It takes people who were not in the same spot or the same time and puts them into a mythic compressed blend. Once you have that blend, you can use language that is designed to refer to human scale situations and refer directly to the blend. And your audience usually understands how the reference to the blend is supposed to be unpacked to handle the conceptual connections in the network. So, for instance, we can say now of the blend, Hicham El-Garouche beat Roger Bannister. Of course, they never ran against each other. In what sense did he beat Roger Bannister? Well, in the blend, he did. We're not deluded. We know how that structure in the compressed nutshell blend unpacks to the network that it organizes. Consider how the Science Times described the North American pronghorn in 1996. The North American pronghorn embarrasses its predators. It's excessively fast. It just makes them look foolish. So it's a question in evolutionary biology. Why evolution? Notice I'm anthropomorphizing here. That's a standard thing to do with evolution. It creates a compressed blend. Why evolution would have invested the resources to make this North American pronghorn much faster than it needs to be? And the answer is that, well, it's being chased by ghosts of predators past. That is, cheetahs, long-legged dogs, mountain lions, things that do not exist anymore. Now, of course, it can't actually be chased by these things. Of course, it cannot remember their existence. But in the blend, the causation that runs over the evolution of a species is compressed to recognition, learning, and intentionality. We have a quasi-agent of a sort. There is, of course, no one North American pronghorn. There are lots of them, and there have been lots of them over time. Now they're all compressed to a single organism that can learn and that can remember. We're not deluded. We do not expect to look out on the American prairie, the American plain, and see ghosts of cheetahs chasing these frisky little North American pronghorns. But that provides us, the compressed blend provides us with a nutshell congenial scene that the human mind can handle and use to reach up and access and manipulate parts of a network that otherwise would lie beyond our conception. When an organization wanted to persuade people to invest in American education, they ran a series of ads. One of them, for example, is Joey, Katie, and Todd will be performing your bypass. Now this is something you will never see. 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds about to perform a bypass operation in a surgical theater, looking straight at you. In the blend, you're about to be operated on by these incompetent young children. So naturally, this recruits strong emotional response. You'd like them to be competent, and you only have a few minutes to make them competent. This produces a compressed nutshell reaction, which we can use to unpack to the network of time, space, causation, and agency. And in this network, an investment in education now will produce doctors and technicians and so on, who much, much later will be doing things that we will care about at that time. We even use language of compression to refer to the blend. We say, before you know it, in the blend, although of course in the decompressed network, we're probably talking about 20, maybe 30, maybe 40 years time span. We talk about tomorrow's good jobs. And of course, outside of the blend, it's not tomorrow. But in the blend, we have achieved a time compression that makes a scene congenial to human thought, congenial in the sense that we are mentally equipped to handle it, and a scene that can recruit all of our systems for responding to consequentiality. To summarize, the key open cognitive scientific problem is that thought in its processes cannot stretch very far over time, space, causation, or agency. Biologically, the reach of thought is quite tiny, but in its content, thought does span indefinitely far over these regions. Somehow, very local biology must be tricked, used, manipulated into manufacturing very local thought whose content is taken to be very expansive. This is a startling mismatch between production and result, and the proposal here is that we use the techniques and operations of mental blending, of making connections, of selective projection, of establishing new vital relations in the blend, and so on, to create compressed, congenial, good blends that we can use, that we can stand on as a platform to reach up and manage enormous networks that otherwise would lie beyond our reach. One analogy for thinking about the human mind and what it encounters as it goes through life is the job of a spacecraft that has to go from Earth to Mars and land there. It can take only a little with it, and the little it takes must be portable, must be packed very tightly for travel, the resources that are suitable for the travel, and when it lands in a new environment, it has to unpack its resources and begin to plug them into the environment in order to operate, to deploy what it has in order to manage and deal with its situation. But then, unlike the actual spacecraft, the human being has to pack back up, as it were, to reassemble one's mental abilities, one's mental portable ideas into something that can be carried to the next environment and unpacked again. And since it has to repack what it's got and leave, there's an opportunity for learning from the previous context in which we unpacked what we brought. We all know that when we pack things back up, they might be a little different. They might include a little more. They might show the influence of where they have been. And then off we go to our next environment. So we travel a lot on planes and so on. And when we go, we do not take our whole city. We do not take our whole house. We do not take all of our stuff. On the contrary, we take a little rolling bag. It's very tight, very compressed. It's designed to go on the airplane perfectly down the airplane aisle. It's designed to be lifted up and put into another little compartment along with similar such bags. In fact, it's got a great deal in it. It's got passports, it's got adapters, it's got credit cards, it's got a variety of things. Toothbrush, for example. We don't take water with us when we travel. In fact, we're not allowed to anymore on the plane. We have to wait for them to serve us the water. But we can take a toothbrush on the understanding that when we land where we're going to land, somehow, we don't know how, there will be water. We will be able to operate. And I think of our repertoire of interrelated linguistic constructions, our many compressed, compact ideas, as like these portable elements, these things that we can carry into new environments and use, and then when we repack, our kit is just a little different. It shows the influence of where we have been. We pack it back up, and off we roll to the next scene to unpack again and plug into the world, to use these compressed, portable ideas and structures as a basis for constructing and managing vast ideas and conceptual networks. When we look, we find that linguistic systems have very many powerful constructions that we can use to prompt people to assemble these conceptual integration networks that include blends. Many of them are extremely obvious and have been analyzed in the literature a number of places. Let me pick out one that you may not have noticed. This is one analyzed by Kiki Nikiforidou. It's the construction of a past tense in a verb with a proximal deictic. Now, what's a proximal deictic? A proximal deictic is something like now as opposed to then, or I as opposed to you, or here as opposed to there, or this as opposed to that. They're proximal to the speaker. They're deictic because they have different interpretations depending on who says them. If I say I, it means one thing. If you say I, it means a different thing. That's a deictic. Now, proximal deictics are, of course, proximal, close, but past is distal. It means sort of at a distance, at a conceptual distance. So how can you get a past tense, which is distal, combined with a proximal deictic, which is proximal? Doesn't this present a kind of contradiction? Well, Kiki Nikiforidou analyzes this as a prompt to a compressed blend, performing a time compression that blends different viewpoints. It is used to prompt for a scene of narration. Nikiforidou reviewed the British National Corpus to show that this construction is widely used in everyday language. It's not in the least restricted to fictional or imaginative or literary contexts. The past tense signifies that you have a narrator who is regarding the narrated events from a distance. And for the purpose of setting up and situating those events, you are projecting from the narrator's viewpoint. But the now is attached to a present, as it were, of experience by a consciousness inside the narrated events that is experiencing the events that are being narrated. So in the blended viewpoint, you have some of the narrator's viewpoint on the situation of the events in the large context, but you have the narrated consciousness's viewpoint on the experiences that those narrated events induce. Presciently, Nikiforidou wrote that the past plus now pattern serves to shift the perspective to a vantage point close to or inside the narrated events with an effect of zooming in on the events. Now, here's something interesting. Actual human vision can't zoom in. It can focus on this or that. It has many techniques of selective attention. You can also walk closer to something or walk away from somebody. But zooming is a matter of staying in one position and changing the size of something in the visual field. This is easy to do in imagination. So focus on some architectural building or bridge or something that you know well. Focus on it in mind. You have it? Good. Now zoom in. Now zoom out. Very easy to do. And there's something else that can actually zoom, and that's a camera. So I went to the Communication Studies Archive at the University of California Library. I'm involved with this project, and I searched 200,000 hours of recorded programs for this grammatical pattern. Got many thousands of hits, of course. And one of the things I found is that when this grammatical pattern, this construction, is used, it's often the case that the camera zooms in on the consciousness that is experiencing the events, or does a kind of jump cut closer to the agent, to the consciousness that is having the experience. This presents a little problem for the television network news, because although it's very easy in language or in imagination to call up a representation of those past events that are being narrated, in fact it's a little difficult to do on the TV, because, well, those are past events. And there are a number of possibilities. One is to have the person who now corresponds to the consciousness in the past dramatize or reenact that action. Another is to take still photographs of that narrated event and that narrated consciousness, and to use the photographs in a kind of dynamic way that suggests activity, mental activity, by the consciousness inside the narrated event. A third one is to get historical footage. Here is an example. Kim now saw, Kim now wondered. In this example, the Kim who was living now in the time of the narrator and the narration dramatizes, that is, reenacts the Kim who is the consciousness inside the narrated event having these experiences.
Kim now saw that the investment story had been far-fetched all along. The promised returns simply too good to be true. And while most of the investors seemed to have their hearts in the right place, Kim now wondered where their heads were, her own mother included. Did you express your concerns to your mother?
Yes.
And how did she respond?
She didn't want to lose faith. She was still a believer.
Naturally, we sometimes think of the narrator and the consciousness narrated as standing in an identity relationship in the network. Here's an example in which Daniel Ellsberg, decades later, is narrating his experiences when he was just discovering the contents of the Pentagon Papers, a secret and voluminous review of the origin and conduct of the Vietnam War. What you'll see in this is, as Daniel Ellsberg narrates, images of him reading the Pentagon Papers. There's a montage effect in which, for example, you see his fingers tracing across the letters, the typescript of the Pentagon Papers, as the events that he is referring to, having to do with the Vietnam War, are portrayed through historical footage. He says, "I now saw that Johnson was continuing a pattern of presidential lying."
But the cost of defending freedom, of defending America, must be paid in many forms and in many places.
Eisenhower supported a brutal dictator in canceling elections called for by the 1954 Geneva Accords. So we opposed elections while pretending to support democracy.
We are attempting to help Vietnam maintain its independence and not fall under the domination of the communists.
Kennedy lied to the public and to Congress, saying we would need only advisors, even though his own military experts told him that South Vietnam would be lost without an immediate commitment of American combat units.
We still seek no wider war.
I now saw that Johnson was continuing a pattern of presidential lying. Each president wanted to avoid the stigma of losing Indochina to communism on his watch. It wasn't that we were on the wrong side. We were the wrong side.
It is not only faraway times and faraway spaces that lie in a network that is vast and includes an awful lot of detail that we need to compress. Take, for example, the present. The present is often not quite so clear. There might be many possibilities, and we don't know which one is actual, but we need to make decisions. Here's a case used by navigators. I am a coastal navigator. To think about the present. It's called the fixed triangle. If you are on a boat and you want to know where you are and you have a chart, well, you take a bearing to something that you recognize, something that's on the chart. Of course, charts, maps, and diagrams are already astonishingly useful nutshell compressions. We know that we're not actually on the map. We know that the chart is not actually the same thing as a territory. We know that the little line on the chart, which is maybe 2 inches long, is not our actual bearing. Our actual bearing is a direction in the visual field from us when we are on the boat to something that's on the shore. But in the blend, we, our boat, are on the line of that bearing. Well, that only tells us something about where we are, namely we're on this line. So to find out where we actually are, we have to take another bearing. And we put it on the chart, and of course we should be, if all is working well, exactly at the intersection of those two lines. A digression, what does it mean that we are at the intersection of those two lines? It means that we have a compressed blend of lines on a chart, and we know how to use that compressed nutshell blend to expand, to connect to the network that involves our present reality on the actual boat, on the actual water, somewhere near a visible shore. But of course, we are at that intersection only if everything is working just right. So all navigators take a third bearing to see whether or not it lines up with the original intersection. It typically doesn't, and the three bearings on the chart make a triangle. And the size of that triangle is very important to the navigator. What is that triangle? Well, it's not actually a triangle that you can see on the water. In fact, the whole point is you don't know when you're standing on that boat exactly where you are in relation to that triangle. The triangle is not picking out something in your present. It's picking out what you don't know about your present. It is presenting a range of possibilities. The possibility space for you lies inside that triangle. Your boat is somewhere inside that triangle. You don't know where. And if, for example, parts of that triangle are very close to something that would destroy your boat, then you need to take immediate action in order to make certain that that possible present is not turned into a disastrous near-term future. Of course, you may well be over in a part of the triangle in which everything is hunky-dory and you don't need to worry at all. This fixed triangle on the chart gives you a compression, not just of time and space and causation and agency, but a possibility in a network where you bear the responsibility for making certain that the possibilities that you might inhabit are not ones that can lead to property damage, loss of the boat, death. We also, of course, compress the future. Here, for example, is the kind of thing we see all the time in weather forecasts. It is a representation in the here and now of the future of the path of a hurricane. Again, there can be different possibilities in this network, this time not of possible presents, but of possible futures. So here is a static representation of different possible paths of the hurricane stretching over time. And in this dynamic representation, the weathercaster will use a green sweep on the weather map that compresses not only the possible geographical situation of the hurricane, but also our epistemological relationship to it. In other words, as time rolls forward, our ignorance about the location of the hurricane increases. So this sweep has the little circles for the hurricane going along a certain path, but it also has a width to the sweep that expands, and the expansion of that width is an indication of our increasing ignorance. So in one spot in time and space, at human scale, right in front of us, we see a dynamic event that represents futures, possibilities, and our degree of knowledge.
It likely is going to be somewhere close to South Florida by the end of this week, perhaps Thursday or Friday.
One of the most useful compressions of time, space, causation, agency, possibility, and consequences is the shrinking triangle. This is a blend used in navigation for direct decision making. So it works like this. One of the things that's easy for human beings to imagine is something moving at a constant speed along a linear path. That can be expanded to thinking about something moving at a constant speed along a path and leaving a track. And this can be blended with, compressed with, the movement of a ship on the ocean. In the blend, the ship leaves a track. Now, of course, in the actual world, the wake of the boat is something that fades fairly quickly. But in the blend, you can have this time compression in which the boat moves along its bearing at a constant speed. It's constant speed along a linear path with a track. And you can get not only one of those, you can perform the blend again for another boat and get two of them. And this is what you use when you're out on the ocean, looking at another boat on the horizon, somewhere else on the water. In fact, it works for anything else you can see from the boat, including stationary objects. But for the moment, let's just think about two boats. So you have the two tracks, the two bearings, the two lines along which the boats are moving at constant but perhaps different speeds. And you want to know whether or not you're going to collide. You want to know whether you're going to hit that other boat. It can be very difficult out on the ocean actually to detect what's going on in time and space and in the future. But let's just suppose you do collide. If you're going to collide, then of course there's an intersection of your courses, and let's call that intersection C. Then the position you are presently in on your boat, the position of the other boat, and C, the point of collision, make a triangle. If you are going to collide, then you have to arrive at point C at the same time, which means the two boats have to traverse their courses to that point in the same amount of time, which means that each boat has to traverse for any particular segment of time the same percentage of its course toward the collision point C. This means that at any given moment, the triangle on the water, whose vertices are the positions of the two boats plus the collision point, will be similar to any of the other triangles that exist at any other time during this movement to the collision point. That means that the triangle in the blend shrinks. It shrinks down to a point where you collide. So to use the blend, the navigator stands on the ship and looks at the other ship and keeps it at a constant spot in the field of vision. One does this by picking out some element of one's own ship and lining up that element with the other ship in the distance. And then you just stand and watch the other ship for a while. And if that ship stays at the same spot in your field of vision over a little span of time and is getting bigger, then it means you're going to collide. The short, compressed, descriptive phrase for this is constant bearing, decreasing range. If that's happening, then you're in trouble. And another compression to help you remember this is charter boaters detest returning, CBDR. Now this blend lets us think far beyond human scale. It lets us think at network scale. It gives us something compressed at congenial human scale that we can use, a platform we can stand on to reach up and manage this diffuse, vast network. In fact, the future is only slightly specified by this blend. But in all the versions of that future, with all the different triangles, there is a collision. So the blend organizes the network. We can conceive the blend, and it lets us hold on to the network. It lets us reason in the network and draw inferences and make decisions about our present action. But think about the emergent structure that's in this blend in the same sort of way that in the cyclic day there is the emergent structure of repetition and coming around again and slots for habitual items. In this blend, there is an amazing central feature, the shrinking triangle. Now, of course, there's no triangle to begin with. First, imagining a single triangle on the water, stretching across the water, is really already an amazing compression. You have to take your concept of a triangle, which you certainly do not see on the water, and compress it with your current situation when you're looking at the other boat. But we have achieved this idea of a triangle for a particular moment in our navigation. But notice that it's not even a triangle. The sailor actually doesn't know any of the lengths of this triangle. You don't know how far away that other boat is because you don't know how big the boat is. You don't know exactly what course it's on, right? So you don't know where the collision point is. You don't actually know the lengths of the sides of the triangle. So what the sailor knows, the navigator knows, is not a triangle, but instead a set of constraints on the relevant but unknown triangle. There's actually an uncountable infinity of triangles that fit these constraints, right? But they're all packed into one. We create one thing in the blend. Now the next compression, and one that is quite different from the compression of all the possible static triangles into one static triangle, works this way. Over time, there's going to be an uncountable infinity of these similar triangles. Each of them is static. None of them shrinks. Of course, there's no shrinking triangle in the network. But in the blend, we've created a single triangle. There are disanalogies across all these analogical similar triangles, and those disanalogies are compressed to change for that one unique element, change for that single triangle, and the change is that the triangle shrinks. the shrinking, just like the triangle, is an emergent phenomenon in the blend. Now, it's not even given that there is going to be a collision. So, in fact, this entire conceptual integration network, with its compressed blend and its shrinking triangle, has to be held as just one possible network, one that is potentially counterfactual to our actual current conditions. Because what we want to do, of course, is make certain that that compressed blend is counterfactual. We don't want to collide, and so we alter our current situation so as to make that entire conceptual integration network counterfactual with respect to a different conceptual integration network, one that we want to inhabit. We want one in which, for example, we cross the course before the other boat gets there, or after the other boat gets there, or where there is no collision point. In any event, what we want to make certain is that there's no shrinking triangle in the blend. So we can do that just by altering something in our current circumstances. That is, we can work in the blend. Let's eliminate the shrinking triangle, and that gives us a different future. When we have arranged to eliminate the shrinking triangle in the blend, then we have a conceptual integration network with a blend that is counterfactual with respect to the other conceptual integration network, the one in which there is a collision. This counterfactual relation is compressed. That is, this relationship between the two networks of counterfactuality is compressed to a feature for our current circumstances, now in the present, where before we were concerned, where before our circumstances looked suspicious and potentially dangerous, now our circumstances are thought of as safe, and we can relax. This is what the word safe actually means. It asks us to put together a certain vast conceptual network in which two different alternatives stand in counterfactual relationship, and the compression of that counterfactual relationship delivers a certain feature for the present. We think of this feature as safe. So safe is not actually a feature. It's not actually something that a situation has. The word safe is a prompt to us to construct one of these enormous, vast conceptual integration networks that stretch across space, time, causation, and agency. Now, the shrinking triangle may look pyrotechnic when you notice what's going on, but in fact it follows this very generic compression template, one of many, but an important one, the same one that we saw in the cyclic day, where we have lots of different situations and analogies that run across all of them, and disanalogies too. And the analogies are compressed to something unique, something manageable, and the disanalogies are compressed to change for that element. So the compression of the analogies delivers the triangle, the compression of the disanalogies delivers the shrinking of that triangle. One of the most useful blended compressions for human beings, one that we use all the time, is the attribution of full minds to other agents. We have no access whatever to the minds of other people. We can talk to them, but talk is not mind. We can see them move. We can see what we take to be their reactions, but in fact we have no access to their minds. We can conceive of a mind for them by projecting what we know of our own mind to a blend. There are, of course, analogies between us and them. We compress those analogies. In the blend, we have another person who now has mind. There are selective projections to the blend, and we can adjust the blend. So they don't have to have exactly our mind, but in the blend, they have a mind that includes components projected from what we know of ourselves. In fact, this is an extremely wide pattern of compression. Projection of mind to other entities goes very, very far beyond simply recognizing that conspecifics can engage with us in prosocial behavior. In the blend, we can attribute mindedness partially through selected projection to things like old clothes, cars, railway locomotives, buildings that are about to be torn down and are sorry that they're about to be torn down. Trees that look smug. We can project it to things that we use, like toasters. Here's a passage from a poem by Thomas M. Dish about a man expressing something to his toaster. You are my friend. I see in you an object, sturdy, staunch, and true. A fellow mettlesome and trim, a brightness that the years can't dim. Now, no one is deluded, right? When the surgeon attributes intentionality to the tumor that she has to remove. This is a surgeon. She knows that a cancerous tumor is not a disease, an infectious disease. She knows it's part of the body. She knows that it has no intentionality whatever. It doesn't know it's a tumor. It doesn't know she exists. It has no mindedness at all. And yet, in the blend, it can become an intentional agent and, moreover, one framed by the human scale conception of an enemy relation. And this can marshal her determination. It can marshal her affective system. It can give her motive, and it can give her a clear conception for managing the network. When someone says that their car just refused to start this morning, they can show anger. Now, if we ask them, do you actually think that your car is a supernatural being that bears an intentional relationship to you? They will look at us as if we're crazy. That's not the point. We're not deluded by those particular blends, but we use them as compressions to manage the network. It's very useful to have them. This kind of understanding that we conceive of other minds through blending has been with us for quite a long time. It has not been described in quite the terms of blending, but the analyses are frequently quite nuanced and detailed. Adam Smith, for instance, in the middle of the 18th century, has long, detailed passages about the mechanisms and consequences of this kind of blending of self and other as a basis of attributing mindedness to other people. But it is not only a conception of other minds that calls for nutshell compression. One of the largest open problems in cognitive science is the explanation of the origin of a concept of personal identity, of self, that stretches over time, space, causation, and agency. I am 58 years old. The person you're looking at and listening to is extraordinarily different from the baby who came out of my mother. And yet we construct a single personal identity for this character. And culture invests extraordinary resources to prop up the stability of this conception. Annual birthday parties, a proper name, for example, enshrined in the language. Many people work on explaining the origin of this concept of a stable self. Evidently, one of the things that we have to do is compress across the analogies and disanalogies in time and space. The analogies are compressed to a single entity, a person, an identity, and the disanalogies are compressed to change for this person. So the person evolves, matures, grows, changes, and so on. In the portable blend, you just have one entity, one changing entity, as opposed to all the detail and information across this vast and diffuse conceptual network having to do with individual experience. Using these two compressions of other and self, we can perform an integration. And now in this blend, there are two people, both with minds, and each of them can be attending to a particular thing, and we can understand by projection that the other mind is attending to the same thing that we are attending to. And because we know in the blend that we know that they are attending to this, we can project to them the idea that they know that we are attending to this. And all the way up the ladder, that we know, that they know, that we know, that they know, and so on. This is a case of classic joint attention. Imagine two people in the same environment attending to something that's directly perceptible to both of them. So one of them says, "Look at that blackbird sitting in the tree." This scene is one of the ones that is most congenial to human beings, most robust, and yet one that seems to mark us out as having a more advanced ability for the conception of interaction, social behavior, and cooperation. Once we have this scene of classic joint attention, we can use it as an input to other compressions, to other conceptual integration networks. So, for example, when you are on the phone talking to someone, you are not actually in a scene of classic joint attention. And you know that. You know that you can't say certain things on the telephone that would be intelligible to somebody who is actually in the environment with you. You can write a personal letter. Now, of course, in the personal letter, the two people involved in the personal letter are not in the same spot, and they're not engaging with the letter at the same time. But in the blend, blended joint attention, you can say things like, "I have your proposal before me, and you have my response before you." This is what Francois Recanati has called the epistolary present. One of the most ubiquitous scenes of blended joint attention is on-screen network news. It is ubiquitous not in the sense that everyone always watches television, but rather that all over the world people are exposed to these clips on the internet, embedded in email that people receive in the sports bar, in the sports gym, in the hotel lobby. Just imagine world events that you did not watch on the television, but clips regarding which you have seen. Now, these clips are astonishing because, of course, the network news is supposed to cover the whole world. Time, space, causation, and agency. Documentaries of things that happened centuries ago. Descriptions of things that face us in the future. As I said earlier, just think of the discussion now of the euro and the eurozone. That's the kind of thing that the on-screen network news routinely discusses. Now, of course, everyone knows that the television anchor is not talking to you personally, doesn't know you personally, will not be aware if you get up to go and answer the door or get a snack from the refrigerator. And yet in the blend, you are there with the anchor, and the anchor could say things to you like, "Welcome back. It's good to see you again. We hope you'll join us for the 11 o'clock news." We're not deluded, but we can use our understanding of the scene of classic joint attention and blend it with lots of other things, with all of that TV technology that we know about, with all of the differences in time and space and location across us, the reporter in the field, the expert analyst who's in the studio, the anchor who might be in a different time zone, and so on. In the blend, we have a compression, which we can understand very simply, in a way, as a scene of blended joint attention. The anchor can point. The anchor can look at a clip that's embedded in such a way that the viewer can see it on the screen, even though the anchor is not seeing it in the same spot. And pointing can say things like, "Here we see or just look at all that broken glass.
God ettermiddag og velkommen til en ekstra nyhetssending fra NRK Nyheter i forbindelse med at det har gått av en bombeeksplosjon i Oslo sentrum for en halv time siden.
Professionals to determine. And they're going to have plenty to consider. Here's what we know so far, though. Much of it from the suspect himself. Something that the victims' families and survivors may know all too well.
Joining me now, Scott Rasmussen, president of RasmussenReports.com and author of The People's Money. Also, Chris Stirewalt, our Fox News digital politics editor and host of Power Play on FoxNews.com. All right, guys, thank you both so much for being here. So, Scott...
To return to the law, one of the most pressing legal debates of our time is the debate over intellectual property. These are blending wars, of course, having to do with what kinds of projections we will make to the blend to conceive of things like intellectual efforts in digital form. So, is every shared file a lost sale? Is the economics of real property something that we actually want to blend with intellectual effort? Well, there's a lot of debate. I can refer you to a range of books, but maybe the best indication of the importance of this debate comes from what we actually saw on the internet web from major sites that we know very well when the United States Congress, contemplating acts known as SOPA and PIPA, was thinking about limiting to some extent the permission to store and distribute or make available various kinds of digital files. Wikipedia put a shuttered page. Imagine a world without free knowledge, this dark and ominous page suggesting that we would lose our access to information. Google put a black rectangle over its logo. Mozilla changed their splash page to protect the internet. That was one day and one phase. And then, of course, following that, there was another phase in which the Research Works Act was proposed. Its intention was to forbid United States governmental agencies from requiring the open access publication of results from research that was funded by those agencies. The use of blending to form nutshell compressions that anchor a network, compressions whose purpose is not to make the network disappear, but rather to make it possible for us to manage and work with such a network, are everywhere. We use them all the time. Think, for example, of culture. It's a very easy, common concept. Of course, there is no such thing as culture, properly considered. Just think of it. Where is culture? What we have in the world across time, space, causation, agency, including hypothetical worlds and counterfactual worlds, is just a bunch of stuff. Things are happening. People do things. Events happen. There are certain kinds of causes. There's some kind of agency. There are different times. There are different spaces. Just a bunch of stuff. We compress that stuff to certain kinds of patterns, or another way of looking at it, our concept of human scale patterns may be what makes it possible for us to detect and recognize some of that stuff in the first place. We then compress those patterns further into an entity, culture, and we attribute certain kinds of causality and even intentionality to that entity in the compressed blend. We say culture teaches us. Culture will resist. Culture certainly does not want us to do this kind of thing. My culture makes it impossible for me to so-and-so. Culture conduces to the following kinds of decision. We are not wrong to make these compressions. On the contrary, they are the kinds of things that make it possible for us to have vast ideas in here and now minds. Science routinely tries to create compressions that we can carry with us for unpacking to make sense of the world. Atoms, chemical elements, differential equations, laws. In the social sciences, there have been similar attempts to create compressions that will help us understand how we think and how human beings operate. Recently, in microeconomics and game theory, there have been proposals for a set of compressions according to which we will know how people will act in interactive decision-making as a function of the players, what they know, what their payoffs are, what the action sequences are, and so on. Each of the people engaged in the interactive decision-making will contemplate what the other person is likely to do, following certain kinds of decision mechanisms, decision principles, and they will reason back from those potential futures to the decision they need to make at this point in the action sequence in order to make counterfactual in the future the outcomes that they don't prefer. This set of decision-making principles in interactive decision-making is frequently called Nash, after John Nash, the game theorist, or more exactly, the pursuit of sub-game perfect Nash equilibrium. It's no news anywhere in the literature that in fact in real play, subjects do not follow Nash, they do not follow sub-game perfect Nash equilibrium. So, for example, Matt McCubbins and I ran a very long battery of within-subject tasks, 190 subjects, involving many of the classic kinds of game theoretic tasks that subjects are usually exposed to. It's no surprise at all that of the 190 subjects, only 85 of them were Nash in Trust Player 1. That's old news. It's no surprise at all that in chicken sequential at the second node, only 129 of the 190 subjects played subgame perfect Nash equilibria. No news at all. That's very, very old news. Usually what happens as a way of repairing the failure of the prediction to match with reality is that the analyst proposes an explanation that has to do with something else involved in how people decide. So, for example, these people went down this path because they're altruistic, or these people went down this path because they're egalitarian, or these people went down this path because they're hawks taking revenge on the other player for having done something that they didn't want the other player to do, or these people are bored and unlikely to operate in a certain kind of way under boredom, or in the sequence of thinking about what the other mind is likely to think. So I think that you think, that I think that you think, that I think that you think that it's going to rain. Different people go a different number of steps in this kind of level K reasoning. All of these are offered as explanation for the data. But of course, an explanation of data you have already investigated is not an explanation. That's epicyclic thinking, that's curve fitting. It's always possible to come up with a description that fits the data that you have amassed, because of course you can make a theory that is just a restatement of the data. For it to count as a theory, as opposed to a redescription, it needs to be tested against out-of-sample data. In other words, You need to take those people you think are altruistic and put them in similar circumstances and see if your ascription of altruism to them would hold. Well, that's what we have done. We have tried to take the proposals we know about for why people do not follow subgame perfect Nash equilibrium solution concepts and see whether or not they hold. So notice this is a within subjects battery. We're looking at the same person, the same subject, performing in task after task after task. I should say this is all anonymous. All of the subjects know that nobody will know what they have done. They are paid for every single decision or answer they give. They are told that their payment is calculated by the computer. This is true. And the only thing that the research assistant will know at the end is how much they are to be paid in an envelope. No one will know the decisions that they made, or rather, no one will be able to attach those decisions to them as holders of a personal identity. There is no repetition of any of these tasks. That is, the subjects are told that they are, for every task, randomly repaired with someone else in the subject pool, and so on. Many sorts of protections. There is no feedback from one subject to the other, except at the very end of this very long battery, where in the interactive games, one subject learns what the other subject has done. So, for example, if you're in the kind of game like Trust or Ultimatum, where one person takes an action, sends a certain amount of money, for example, and the other person has to make a decision once they have that knowledge, well then, yes, you do know a little something about what the other subject has done, but that's all, and we put those at the very end of the battery so that they cannot condition any of the prior performance. Well, what do we find? We find that, in fact, the individual subjects show spectacular variation in how they behave moment to moment throughout the battery. We refer to this as consistently inconsistent. So, for example, if you take some of our tests, some of our tasks, and look at the percentage of players who follow subgame perfect Nash equilibrium, you find that it's all over the lot, that the same subject behaves quite differently, not only in different tasks, but at different moments inside the same task. So inside chicken sequential, the person who plays one way as player one may play very differently as player two. Take, for example, play by these subjects as Trust player one. There were 85 of the 190 subjects who followed subgame perfect Nash equilibrium strategies. As I say, that they're not following these is not a surprise. But why those 85? Are these the 85 for whom we can form a compression that they have a certain kind of personality, or they have a certain signature to the way they think? Well, what did those 85 people do as Trust player 2? No, only 62 of those 85 followed subgame perfect Nash equilibrium, and of those 62, only 59 followed subgame perfect Nash equilibrium strategies in Dictator, and of those 59, only 49 followed subgame perfect Nash equilibrium strategies in Donation, and of those 49, only 26 followed subgame perfect Nash equilibrium strategies in Chicken Sequential 1, and so on down the line. If we just keep adding in the analysis of how they behave in subsequent tasks, you find that the category of people who are supposed to behave in a certain way, because they have a certain signature or they have a certain personality, disappears. It is not only their actions that are consistently inconsistent, so are their beliefs. So we ask them to make guesses about what the other subjects will do, and we tell them they will be paid if they get it right. We don't tell them whether or not they succeeded. That would be feedback. But we tell them that they will get paid a substantial amount if they're right. We ask them to guess what the other person predicted they would do. We ask them to guess what the other person predicted what they guessed that the other person would do, and so on. So on down all of these sorts of chains. And what we find is that their beliefs are also consistently inconsistent. Now, you might think that, well, this is because when you move from task to task, you're changing the frame. We want to be sensitive to that above all. Indeed, that can be the case, but we have configured these tasks so as to be so close in their framing that it's unlikely to be the framing that makes a difference. So, for example, the subject in the role of Trust Player 2 is by design in the same situation as that same subject in the role of the actor in Dictator. By same situation, we mean same mathematical situation, same payoff situation, same action sequence situation going forward. Here are results. We find that of our 190 subjects, 140 of them played Nash, follow subgame perfect Nash equilibrium strategies, as the actor in Dictator. But of those 140, only 89 have a certain Nash belief as Trust Player 2. Now, there's a little bit of difference in the framing between these two situations. So one could allege that framing accounts for the fall from 74% Nash to 47% Nash. Remember, we're taking the subjects who played Nash in Dictator and looking at what they did. Were they Nash in the next situation? Only 89 of them had a certain belief as Trust Player 2, that was Nash. A little bit of difference in the framing. Perhaps one could claim that accounts for the fall. That would be a hypothesis worthy of testing. But for the second, third, fourth, and fifth bars, we are in the identical framing, indeed the identical spot in the identical game. We find subjects in this spot to be consistently inconsistent in their responses. So of the 89 who, in the role of Player 2 in Trust, have a certain Nash belief, only 22 of those, in the same position, the same framing, the same game, have a certain Nash confidence with respect to a different question. What is confidence? We offer them essentially the opportunity to double down on their guesses to earn more or less money. If they're Nash, they should respond in a certain way, and only 22 of the 89 who had responded Nash for a belief question respond Nash for the confidence action. And of those 22, at the same spot, in the same game, with the same framing, only 17 are Nash with regard to another belief we asked them about. And of those 17, again, at the same spot, in the same game, the same framing, only 12 are Nash in response to another confidence opportunity. Framing cannot be used to explain these dramatic inconsistencies, nor can personality features. This is a within-subject design, so we're talking about the identical person. What we find is consistent inconsistency. It's old news that people do not play Nash. The proposals to explain why they don't play Nash all involve stable compressions, ascribing to them certain kinds of dispositions or certain kinds of mental operations. But we've tested those, or we've tested the main ones that we know about, and we find that those hypotheses do not hold up. In fact, they are not stable. What we see is consistent inconsistency. Now, microeconomics and game theory did not make a mistake in trying to produce these scientific compressions that could be unpacked to try to explain the world. No one, for instance, is arguing that this kind of Nash strategy does not apply to playing tic-tac-toe. It does indeed. And moreover, it's just in the natural course of things that compressions that are proposed at one spot in scientific development are discarded in favor of others, or kept around as ideals that we know don't actually apply to the world, but that allow us to make a certain kind of hypothesis in an intelligible way, one that we may want to discard, but that still has to be understandable. We're moving now to different ideas about the kinds of compressions that people might carry with them, the kinds of compressions that science might offer for explaining human behavior. Some of the most interesting ideas about compression and blending come from the humanities. It has long been the case that in the humanities, researchers and scholars have thought about the way the mind makes certain kinds of compressions. Aristotle's Rhetoric, for example, certainly Book 2, is all about certain kind of portable compressions, taxonomies of portable compressions that we can carry with us for the purposes of persuasion in general circumstances or in specific circumstances. The difficulty with the hypotheses from the humanities is that they have not been framed in such a way that science knows how to test them. But these compressions include, for example, the idea that human beings think in terms of small packets of mutually dependent activity. This can be called story, that narrative thinking is fundamental to the cognitively modern human mind, that these stories compress across time, space, causation, and agency, that there are certain kinds of compression patterns that come up again and again, certain kinds of generic integration templates that produce certain kinds of compression. Proverbs, maxims, this above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. Leitmotifs in opera, essential characters and the nature of personal identity. Think, for example, of characters like Sherlock Holmes, an identity so strong that when he steps into any plot, you know that he's going to change the nature of the plot. The conception of self and other, and that dance of projection to the other minds, and the corralling of those other minds into a pro-social operation across a plot. These are the kinds of things that the humanities have studied, the nature of compressions in paintings, sculpture, diagrams, images, architecture, citations. A great deal of discussion in the humanities over 2.5 millennia on the way in which the human mind creates compressions. One of our future projects, of course, will be to see the extent to which we can take some of these proposals about how the human mind works and create small empirical and sometimes even experimental tests to see how they operate. How can the human mind have vast ideas stretching over time, space, causation, and agency when the biological range of our thinking machinery is so limited and, in fact, unable to stretch across those ranges? The proposal here is that the mental operation of blending compresses across vast ranges to provide a blended scenario, a blended mental space that serves in a manner congenial to the human mind, as a platform that we can stand on to reach up, manipulate, access, and change the vast mental network that otherwise would be intractable. We carry these blends with us. They are compressed, but we can take those packed blends and unpack them to plug into the situations in which we find ourselves, to operate in context, and then to repack them with the possibility of learning, of slight changes in these compressed blends, and take them with us forward in life to the next moment in which our limited biological thinking needs to achieve a vast idea. Thank you very much.